Welcome back, everybody. This is an interesting episode. Normally, we have different programs here at the Anarchist Project. We have Trek Wars, and we have our Conversations on Anarchist. Our Trek Wars program is usually dedicated to discussing social, political, economic themes that arise in pop culture. And our Conversations on Anarchist follows our traditional mission of trying to have discussions with scholars, artists, and organizers about questions about oppression, domination, and alternate futures. This episode is a combination of both of those things with some very special guests that I'm very excited to speak to you today with. So my guests today have written an article that appeared late last year in 2022 in the journal Perspectives on Anarchist Theory. And so our episode today is going to be talking about anarchist themes in Star Trek Picard. So my guests today have written this article called Bibliophilia and Anarchism in Star Trek Picard. And I wanted to talk to them a little bit about how they came to find these kinds of revolutionary radical themes in this series, which we've talked about on our programs before. I admit I'm not a big fan of Star Trek Picard, even though I'm a huge Trekkie. We've done various kinds of programs on particularly episode or season 2 of Picard, which was not at all a favorite of mine. But my guests today have really done some great work at excavating some revolutionary and radical themes out of seasons 1 and 2 of Picard. So I wanted to talk with them about this work. My guests today are Maria Angeles Castro. She's a professor in the French and Spanish department at Occidental College in Los Angeles. And my other guest today is Javier Castro. He's an author of a variety of different books, including Imperiled Life, Revolution Against Climate Catastrophe, published by the AK Press, and Eros and Revolution, The Critical Philosophy of Herbert Marcuse, published by Brill. So I'm very excited to have both of you here. Welcome to the program. So I wanted to talk to you about this article that you've written, Bibliophilia and Anarchism in Star Trek Picard. But I guess before we get to that piece, I just wanted to know, and this is something I ask all of my guests who come to talk on Trek Wars, I want to know how you first got interested in studying Star Trek from a scholarly perspective. So are you both fans of science fiction in general? And what brings you to Star Trek and Star Trek Picard in particular?
I guess I start. To me, living as Picard heroic characters do for a cause that will give meaning and hope to humanity and transhumanity is what brings me to this series. To live in revolt and defiance with integrity. Besides the philosophical considerations of the series, is very fun and it's very entertaining. I have seen parts of Star Trek: The Next Generation, and I liked many things about it. I like the professionalism, work ethic of the Enterprise crew. Also, what draws me to the series is the themes of exploration of new worlds and cultures, and interactions with the inhabitants of distant planets. In the field of science fiction and visionary literature, I am a fan of Kim Stanley Robinson and Ursula Le Guin, as they both present alternative utopian societies that reflect liberatory political and social views in a very, very engaging manner.
Javier, what about you? What's your background in science fiction and Star Trek?
I've liked sci-fi since watching Star Wars and reading and watching Jurassic Park as a child in the 90s. I first became interested in Star Trek when I first heard that it was a TV show that portrayed a progressive future in space. And so I've been watching Star Trek for about a decade now, and I've seen all the series other than for Enterprise and Below Decks. I would say I appreciate sci-fi for its imagination, its socio-political commentary, and its cultural critique. I think that at its best, speculative or visionary fiction creates a second world or a mirror universe that's in constant communication with our own first world or prime universe. And actually, in 2021, I wrote a 3-part series for the Commoner on science fiction as protest art. And this was a response to Thomas Wilson Jardine's critique of the much anticipated game Cyberpunk 2077 for promoting interpassivity or substitution. And what I mean is by that is that the argument is that games like Cyberpunk that are subversive, that feature critical revolutionary themes, can actually function to distract from real world struggles rather than stimulate them. But I would say that there's a clear link between mental processes and material reality, or between dreaming and politics. Walida Amarisha writes that, quote, all organizing is science fiction, end quote. Drawing on the late Slavist Richard Steig's analysis of utopian science fiction, writing early on in the Russian Revolution, we can discern dystopias that depict capitalist hells alongside utopias featuring communist heavens in different books, films, TV shows, and games from the past half century plus. Some of these would include, Ursula Le Guin's The Dispossessed, films like Blade Runner, Terminator, The Matrix, Children of Men, Star Wars, books like the Earthseed series, the Mars trilogy, The Children of Men, the novelization, and of course, let's not forget about Star Trek.
Yeah, that's precisely how we here at Anarchist Project approach visionary speculative art in general, is by trying to see how it portrays perhaps a more liberatory future and what that can teach us about our own reality, and particularly the forms of struggle that we might need to engage in order to achieve a more liberatory future. So this is primarily why I was so interested in your work when I saw it. We on the program in the past 2 years or so or more that we've been doing our programming here, we've spoken with different people who have explored and investigated the Star Trek universe in various ways, looking at different kinds of themes. We've spoken with someone who finds Star Trek to represent a socialist Marxist utopia. We've also spoken with a scholar who tries to highlight the sort of imperial or colonialist themes in Star Trek to sort of push back against the kind of liberatory themes that we often so talk about in Star Trek. And so that's why I was particularly interested to find your work, because what you're trying to do is to talk about anarchist themes in Star Trek, and particularly what you find coming out in Star Trek Picard. So I wanted to ask you, before we get into that discussion, could you discuss a little bit about how you understand our anarchism? What do you mean by anarchism as a worldview, as a perspective that you find embedded in Picard? What does anarchism mean to both of you? Maria, we can begin with you, or Javier.
So in terms of anarchism, I think, the definition that I work from is Robert Graham's, which he proposes in the 2015 book published by AK Press, We Do Not Fear Anarchy, We Invoke It, which is a historical study of the First International and the struggles between Bakunin and his allies on the one hand, and Marx and his followers on the other. So Graham, in summarizing that history, derives 6 anarchist principles. And so I'd like to list them here. These include anti-authoritarianism, anti-statism, anti-parliamentarism, federalism, libertarianism, and social revolution. So to this list, Jeff Shantz and Dana Williams add solidarity, mutual aid, cooperation, egalitarianism, and direct action as anarchist principles. So I would say that we see most of these principles in action in most of the Star Trek series, including in Picard. Above all, I would say that we see anti-authoritarianism, libertarianism, federalism, and direct action. That having been said, I can definitely recognize, in preparation for this discussion, and also thinking about our article, that the Federation is not, of course, fully anarchist by itself. I'd say that its political system and economic system is probably closer to democratic socialism, because it's a post-capitalist society that has at least on Earth, has a unitary world government represented on the Federation Council, which is, I guess, something like a Congress or the United Nations General Assembly. So I guess the sharpest contradiction between Federation politics, as we see in Star Trek, and anarchism would be with the question of statism, and maybe also with parliamentarism. But I think as we'll discuss in our conversation today, certainly in Picard, there's a lot of direct action.
Yeah, that's a good point. So, I mean, I think that you're right. And this is something that I've written about in my own work on Star Trek, is that Star Trek does put forward a kind of, and many people talk about this, and they've been talking about this for decades, right? Progressive vision of humanity, and particularly highlighting the kind of egalitarianism and racial justice vision that comes out, for instance, in the early original series, the sort of racially colorblind emphasis that comes out of that series. And as you mentioned, there are a lot of people who sort of point out that there are still lingering kinds of colonial imperialist themes in the idea of going out into the final frontier in some sense. But I like this idea of you finding these kinds of radical threads in the Star Trek universe. And you've hinted at this already, that in some sense, right, the Star Trek universe seems to be something that is, the Federation at least, is built up on a kind of democratic socialist model. But that there are these embedded kind of anarchist notions in it, particularly, like you were saying, direct action, mutual aid, perhaps, solidarity.
Also,
Are some of these ideas, do you find in Picard in particular?
oh, absolutely. Direct action. If we think about La Sirena, the mission of La Sirena and its crew in both seasons, definitely direct action. Picard subverting the Starfleet command by going on his own mission in the first season, and then of course in the second season going back in time, using the Borg Queen. Definitely, I would say is very much a realization or an allegory for, or well, not even more than that. It's a direct visual portrayal of direct action.
Yeah,
And
that's interesting. I mean, because part of these things that, in seasons 1 and season 2 of Picard, right, Picard does have to sort of go rogue in some sense, but that's because in some sense the Federation has lost its way, it seems. I mean, Picard, this is the sort of whole story of the downfall of Picard in season 1, is that the Federation has lost its moral compass, and no longer holding on to these kind of radical themes, but has become more bureaucratic, more nefarious, more secretive, much more sort of focused on maintaining power. So a kind of indictment often that anarchists give of bureaucratic parliamentary systems, right? That inevitably they start off perhaps with these kind of radical egalitarian ideas, but then they move very quickly to a bureaucratic statism that loses moral authority. And for sure, that seems to come out in season 1 of Picard.
absolutely, and in preparation for this episode, I did also watch William Wynn's conversation with you, the Star Trek Communist, and I did appreciate his comment, his analysis of Star Trek Picard's first season, as he compared it to Trotsky's The Revolution Betrayed, which was quite interesting in the sense that, as you said, that the revolution was betrayed. But to that point, and going back to what you said a few moments ago, I wanted to just say that although I think that it's true that the Federation political system is democratic socialist, we can make a comparison with the Russian Revolution and another revolutionary context where there is a revolutionary situation that opens the field for many other different tendencies that might not be just limited to a bureaucratic socialism or bureaucratic authoritarianism. It allows for anarchism, council communism, many other kinds of popular experiments. And I think that maybe in a certain sense, our analysis is kind of in parallel to that we see the anarchist threads that are still existing in the Federation, even though it has become thoroughly bureaucratized.
That's interesting. So, just to, I guess, wrap that up, is that how you understand the radicality of the Star Trek universe? In some sense, is that this is a space in where radical projects have been given a kind of room to be able to be explored by humanity in the future?
The way I understand it is by the character's refusal to submit to these absurd and unjust rules and regulations. by their rebellious actions and decisions, and also by the great vitality and intensity that these heroic characters display in pursuing their dreams. And all of this is very contagious and very uplifting, and it elevates the audience to a level of moral consciousness without a doubt.
I would say, in terms of the question of the radicality of Star Trek universe, a late addition that we didn't quite integrate into the article that we wanted to was to mention Jules Verne's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, specifically Captain Nemo's character, because Nemo has a very advanced technological submarine, and he goes around sinking merchant and warships. So it's kind of almost an anarchist, anti-militarist, not quite pacifist, but anti-commercial critique that we see there. And I think that we can maybe make a connection with Starfleet's vessels being primarily exploratory and scientific rather than military in their function.
Right.
And Kim Stanley Robinson describes that Verne was influenced by Charles Fourier, who was a preeminent feminist, utopian socialist, and theorist of the abolition of labor and sexual liberation. Some of these themes are certainly present in Star Trek. If we look at The Naked Now, the second episode of The Next Generation, we see a shipwide intoxication on the Enterprise that activates free love almost as a general strike.
Yeah.
So age-based hierarchies are inverted. Wesley Crusher becomes the captain. And then when Captain Picard tries to appeal to him, what he tells him, and I quote, is, "You, Picard, don't do the work yourself. You give the orders, but somebody else does it."
Right. Wow, I've never thought about that now, thinking about that, just like the sort of the kinds of ways in which that particular episode discusses, it harkens back to all this kind of utopian literature, the Lupercalia, the Saturnalia, all these. So before I move on, because I want to talk about some of the books that you mentioned in this as part of your analysis, I just want to say I want to encourage you, and I want you to come back to talk with me about your viewing of Star Trek Lower Decks with these themes in mind, because I think that I'm a big fan of the animated series that have come out, particularly Lower Decks, because I think that it provides some really interesting class conscious critiques of the Star Trek universe in various ways. Ultimately, I think it sort of reifies the progressive vision, but it does raise some of these kinds of questions that you're bringing up. And so I'd love to talk to you about that. So I want to set a future date with both of you after you've seen Lower Decks to see how you might bring this analysis around to that particular series, which I think you would both like. But you mentioned talking about Jules Verne, and one of the things that your article in Perspectives on Anarchist Theory does well is highlight the importance of certain novels and stories in the actual portrayal of characters in Star Trek Picard, particularly in the first season. You see books coming out quite a bit. All right, there's a lot of mention of books and mention of stories, particularly, for instance, Asimov. And then, interestingly enough, and I did a video a little bit about this too, there is a lot of emphasis on Miguel de Unamuno, the Spanish existentialist, and his relationship to Rios. Rios is portrayed as reading Unamuno on the Serena. And so what you do in this article is you talk about how the importance of these different authors and novels in the portrayal of radicality in Star Trek Picard. You both point out that these books somehow accentuate possible anarchist themes or ideas. And so I was wondering if you could essentially explain a little bit about this emphasis on bibliophilia in Picard, how the choice of using books to promote radical ideas comes out in season 1 particular and season 2 of Picard.
Well, the books that appear in Star Trek Picard contain radical themes and ideas, and they provide a reinforcement of the narrative, progressive values and meanings. They also reflect, they also mirror the good or heroic characters' preoccupations with freedom, with justice, with inclusion, and with rebelliousness. There are many books that appear in this series, but I will just mention and make a small analysis of the relationship between the narrative and the book that appears in the series. The first book that the series show is The Complete Robot by Isaac Asimov. This science fiction literary creation emphasizes respect and solidarity with android creatures. And this central theme reflects Picard's radical concern with the need to include and protect life in general, but especially the lives of advanced, intelligent, artificial beings within our universe, within our galaxy. The second book that appears in the series, Star Trek Picard, is The Tragic Sense of Life by Miguel de Unamuno, the Spanish philosopher and professor of the University of Salamanca, who was also a member of the literary movement, the Generation of '98. Captain Rios, who is the character who is affected by this book, particularly at one point during the narrative says, and I quote, "To be Starfleet to the core is my tragic sense of life." Echoing Unamuno's revolutionary idea of sacrificing for others as his ultimate mission in life. And this sacrifice entails to save android lives from the authoritarian aggression of the Romulan secret police, the Zat Vash, against non-conventional outgroups. Rios, without a doubt, identifies with risk, and thus with the existential pain of living with the consciousness of death, which is a central idea in Unamuno's philosophy. Besides these two books, Star Trek Picard also includes the visual presence of other extraordinary radical books on the series. Of note, I would like to mention the novel The Stranger, L'Étranger, and the essay The Rebel, or L'Homme Révolté, de Albert Camus. Camus was a political activist, and his books reflect his views against oppression and slavery. The Rebel is the study of rebellion and revolt and its motivations in societies. The novel The Stranger, or L'Étranger, centers on the theme of alienation in society and contains a profound critique of conformity and indifference as well. Picard and Rios, echoing Camus, do not believe in a system that has alienated them and others, and thus act in a rebellious way against injustice by embracing a very dangerous and possibly suicidal mission to rescue android life in the galaxy. There are many other books in the series that I could discuss and summarize, but I will just say that their presence in the series emphasize the importance of living our lives, or the lives of Star Trek Picard's characters, as to make them worth living in their struggle against authoritarian values and viewpoints.
If I could just briefly add here, I'd like just to mention two titles. One would be Don Quixote, which is mentioned not directly but indirectly when Admiral Clancy mentions to Picard that he's a senile old fool, that he's quixotic, or I'm not sure if it was Picard that said it himself, but anyway, yes, because definitely Picard is kind of a quixotic character who launches adventures that indeed seek justice, seek redress, as with Dodge and Soji, the android twin sisters. And not only that, but we also see the Three Musketeers. So Picard brings the Three Musketeers to the Romulan boy as a gift, and we see definitely that also be reflected in the crew of La Sirena, which all is not it's more than just three people, but we can say that it's kind of like the Three Musketeers in that they are taking direct action, they are united in a collective effort to defend principles. Of course, we can definitely contrast the principles that are defended by the Three Musketeers, which are, basically royalism, versus the principles of the Federation, which are, Enlightenment principles, socialist, and even anarchist principles. But yeah, I think that I agree with Hamilton that, most of the books that we see coming out in the series do indeed reinforce the progressive narrative.
So this is really fascinating. So I want to ask you a question about Rios in particular.
Mhm.
So I last year when season 2 ended, I did a program with my colleague Jason Scully, and we talked about the representations of mental health and race in season 2 of Picard. And we both agreed that we did not like season 2. But you're making me reassess my evaluation and discussing this with you. But I wanted to ask you about Rios. My feeling was I was really disappointed with the way that Rios was treated and the way that he was dismissed in this series. I thought he was a very interesting character because of the portrayal in season 1. I wanted to see him as a Starfleet captain, and we get a glimpse of him in season 2. But then, right, spoilers, right? He decides that he wants to go back and live in the 21st century and build a life there, knowing that World War III is about to break out at any minute in that timeline. And I just felt that Rios was done wrong by this series. I felt that it was a really interesting character, and particularly one of our first prominent Latinx captains gets shunted away in a way that felt at the time perhaps not authentic to the character. But I'm reassessing that now based on what you said, because maybe him going back in time to help humanity at one of its darkest periods, right before nuclear catastrophe, maybe that was him being consistent with his tragic sense of life. Do you have any thoughts about that? Am I misreading the Rios here, or was the Rios really just done wrong in season 2?
Javier,
What do you think
do
of
you
it?
want?
Yeah, sure. I mean, certainly, I can see what you mean by that, because, and even in season 1, I think there was kind of some lost potential for where his character could have gone. I mean, definitely, it was very interesting to see his split, how he had what was it, like 5 or 6 doubles on Latina in the first season, who were his comrades or his companions, because he didn't seem to have any. And of course, he was obviously, as I haven't seen the episode you're mentioning, Jose Antonio, but I can imagine what you're talking about, because clearly there is a lot of psychiatric mental health implications in Rios's character, especially in season 1, but also in season 2. And I definitely, I can sympathize with what you mean, that yeah, he kind of did. It was a tease, the few scenes that we see where before the Borg Queen does her thing, or at the beginning of the season, and then at the end, he is there for just a moment as the Star Trek captain, but then he, I guess, chooses the domestic narrative, right? Which is, I guess, I don't know, it could go both ways, because in a certain sense, he's kind of rejecting the sacrifice that Starfleet, of course, entails, right? Which is you know losing your life out in the Delta Quadrant or something like that on some highly secret mission, versus having some kind of a family life, an adopted son, and so on. So I can definitely see what you mean, but I can also see how the argument might go both ways in that sense.
Yeah, part of the
What do you
reason I
think?
think that it's interesting is because, based on what you said, Maria and Javier, um, I mean, apparently, according at the end of season 2, the Rios died in a bar fight in North Africa, somewhere in the 21st century, but that he devoted his life to trying to ship medical aid around the globe with his newfound wife that he met during season 2. So part of it is he sacrificed the life of a Starfleet captain to go back for domesticity to a certain extent, but he was also still this kind of rogue character that was out helping the world. As I mentioned at a time that the world is collapsing in the 21st century, right? This is the dystopian part of the Star Trek universe, is that in order to get to the utopia that we've been talking about, humanity has to go through this really awful period that culminates in nuclear catastrophe, as we see depicted in Strange New World season 1. But Rios sort of jumps in the midst of one of the worst periods of humanity to do his work. And so I don't know, perhaps I'm now thinking sort of off the cuff, but maybe Rios wasn't done poorly in this series. Maybe he lived his life according to the principles that we saw being laid out in season 1, which is a matter of rebelliousness, risk-taking, but risk-taking for a greater sense of justice. If we read Rios that way, that's how he lived and died in season 2.
Yeah,
so,
it's almost like a sacrificial death, right?
Right. Well, I don't know. So in this conversation, you've made me reassess my opinion of season 2. I still miss Rios. I wish we had more Latinx representation in Star Trek, but this was a powerful character, and maybe more powerful now for what you've said in the conversation. So,
well, I'm glad that our perceptions had some type of illumination or enlightenment.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. Thank you. Well,
if I could just add, Jose Antonio, sorry, if I could just interject. Well, actually, it's really funny because now that the way that you're framing it, and I had kind of forgotten the Rios's end in the end of season 2, but the way that you're framing it now, I kind of think it does actually fit with Camus and his critique, because Camus was very, very focused on the critique of authoritarian leftism, bureaucratic communism, Stalinism. That's why he, had his friend breakup with Sartre, specifically on this question of, because he was an anarcho-syndicalist versus Sartre at that time was a Stalinist sympathizer. And, I definitely recall in the Rebel that Camus, one of his main lines of critique there is that the rebel, the anarchist, the activist should not have to decide, should not have to, choose between pleasure and sacrifice, that both of those are actually an essential part of the revolutionary life. That's remained etched in my mind. So I think that is very much consistent with the way that you just presented Rios's end.
Wow, fascinating. Yeah, I don't think I would have come to that sort of reading without you two. So thank you. Well, let me ask you this a little bit about some critiques of the sort of radicality of Star Trek. As you mentioned, Javier, in the past, we've talked with people, Will Wynn, that, for instance, the Star Trek communist, who, in his view, sees Star Trek, the universe, as embodying what he considers largely a kind of a Marxist-Leninist perspective. But we've also talked with Lee McKagan on the program, and her work, and whether or not the Federation is an empire. And so both of you have talked a little bit about how you think that Star Trek is the universe emphasizes overall these messages of a progressive future, of a rebellious character standing against authoritarianism. I wanted to ask you, though, this is in the context of the Federation, of a kind of utopia that is about going, after all, to strange new worlds, right? That in itself, some people have criticized as sort of having these highlights of a colonial perspective, like who are they strange for? And so that Star Trek may have these radical ideas, but fundamentally it begins from a kind of colonial human-centric perspective about going out in space. I wanted to know, in your overall sense, is Star Trek, the universe, this kind of fixture of pop culture, somewhere that we can go to learn about radical ideas? Or do you think that it's just too compromised by some of these colonial assumptions to be enlightening about what something like anarchism is today? I mean, so in other words, like if someone wanted to know what anarchism is, would you recommend them Star Trek, the Star Trek universe, as a place maybe to think about these themes? Or is it too watered down in the kind of radicality that you think it presents to be useful for us to learn about radical ideas today?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I've thought a lot about it in the last few days. So I have a lot of comments to share on these questions. I would say, fundamentally, I would say that it's not excessively compromised. I would encourage people, my friends, people I don't know, society in general, humanity, to watch Star Trek. Absolutely, big fan of Star Trek. And I think I want to push back a little bit. I want to talk about Nguyen's representation of Star Trek because I found that very thought provoking, and also Dr. McKagan's because I want to push back a little bit on both of them. So I think we'll have a little bit of a polemic, not in a bad way though. So, I mean, it's clear that the Star Trek universe presents a positive future of cosmic communism and Enlightenment rationalism, as you know, in other episodes you've had, Jose Antonio, where have shown that scarcity profit classes are abolished on Earth and across the Federation with the help of science and technology. War is abolished within the borders of the Federation, and this echoes Immanuel Kant's vision of perpetual peace. Of course, to your point in the question that you're posing, you know, it's incontestable that Kant was a sexist and white supremacist. So Deep Space Nine, which you know, coming after the Next Generation, introduces a lot of these more critical concepts. In Deep Space Nine, we see the two-part episode Past Tense, which shows how the so-called Bell riots in San Francisco paved the way for the coming of the Federation. And of course, you know, the Next Generation itself begins with an allegory two-part episode where the crew of the Enterprise liberates a being that had been imprisoned and exploited by the Bandy species at Farpoint Station. Plus, Lieutenant Riker later reveals that humans in the Federation no longer enslave animals for food purposes. I think this vegan critique was kind of lost along the way, but it's still definitely there in the Next Generation. And to the question of imperialism, well, I think we have to think about, you know, Starfleet's Prime Directive, also known as the Non-Interference Directive, which is Starfleet's General Order Number 1. The Prime Directive, of course, is meant to respect the internal development of cultures and civilizations that Starfleet crews might encounter, much in the way that I think national sovereignty is supposed to be protected in the United Nations system, so as to prevent a return to colonialism as in the 19th century. So in this sense, we can interpret the Prime Directive as being fundamentally anti-imperialist, although, you know, much of the drama of Star Trek is based on the numerous violations of this Prime Directive across many of the series. And I want to add here that, you know, we understood that there was a rumor, though not confirmed, that Roddenberry himself, Gene Roddenberry, was sympathizing with Trotskyism. And we can kind of, in this sense, we can kind of interpret the Borg, the struggle with the Borg, as an anti-Stalinist or an anti-Maoist critique, in the sense that the Borg present as very aggressive, highly technologically advanced, having a collective consciousness, and being bureaucratic and authoritarian.
Can I stop you just a minute there, Javier?
Sure.
So that point about Roddenberry, I hadn't heard before, and so it was the first time I saw that in your article. Could you explain that a little bit, because this is something that I don't know is particularly widespread. This rumor or this potential connection of
Sure.
Roddenberry personally to some kind of radical movement.
Sure. So my understanding is that he was rumored to be a member of the Socialist Workers' Party, which is still a Trotskyist organization. I had read that that was somewhere located online in like the 90s or 2000s, but by the time that I had, you know, looked into it myself, the website was erased, so I couldn't find it either way. But I think that you know, it definitely could fit with, you know, to Will Nguyen's point about the revolution portrayed. I think that the Trotskyist critique of the bureaucratization of the revolution, you can see that even in the Next Generation episode on conspiracy, where, you know, the Starfleet command itself has become corrupt. Let me see.
Yeah, thank you. I just apologize for breaking in and what you were saying, but I wanted
you're
to
fine.
follow that up because I thought that was a really fascinating point that I'd never heard about. So thank you.
Absolutely. But I think also we can see some of the traces of Trotskyism in Starfleet Federation politics. For example, you know, as Nguyen has pointed out, you know, rank remains within Starfleet command, or, you know, the Starfleet ships, whereas in the Russian Revolution, rank was definitely abolished early on. Stalin then reimposed it. And I also wanted to mention here, before I go to the question of imperialism, because I really want to focus on that, But I want to also mention something very new, which is that Star Trek, together with Leonard Nimoy's family, have teamed up with LA Care, which is an insurance company here in LA that serves a low-income population. It's basically a Medi-Cal expansion program. So Star Trek and the Nimoy family have come together with LA Care to promote vaccination for COVID-19 in certain Los Angeles neighborhoods. And so this is kind of a very interesting thing because it shows kind of how the Star Trek message of rationalism, humanism, collective well-being, um, and and support of science can actually play a role in our own world, today. And it's also kind of interesting because it seems that by doing this, the Nimoy family and whoever at Star Trek is getting involved is kind of taking a stance against all this anti-vaccine conspiracism and obviously, the great worldwide damage and mass death that COVID-19 has implied. So I just wanted to now address the question of colonialism and imperialism in Star Trek. So I did, a few minutes ago mentioned the Prime Directive, which is a very important thing to think about. So Dr. McKagan, she was analyzing Voyager in the episode that I saw with you, and she was mentioning how Voyager, the narrative champions liberalism, Western humanitarianism. But I wanted to ask here, well, what about the Maquis? Because the Maquis are kind of like this rebel movement within Starfleet or within the Federation, who are kind of reminiscent of pirates, almost like even I want to even go as far as to say that they're like kind of Kronstadt sailors from the Russian Revolution, in the sense that they are calling the Federation on its own principles, in the sense that they're being oppressed by Cardassia, which is another empire, a very violent totalitarian empire. And they're taking direct action against Cardassia to the disapproval of the Federation, right? So it's kind of a very interesting subplot that we see there at the end of The Next Generation with Ro Laren. So I want to conclude here on the point about imperialism, because I think that there's almost a sense that cross-cultural interaction is imperialist or racist in itself, and of course there is a large possibility there, as Edward Said in Orientalism has shown us, as many post-colonial theorists have shown us, definitely. But I wouldn't want to say that it's 100% necessarily has to be that way. We have to look at the specifics of it all. So, Jose Antonio, in your conversation with Dr. McKagan, you mentioned how the original series of Star Trek was originally conceived as a frontier Western, right? But I want to also here mention that, Soldier Blue, which was a film that came out in 1970, was also a Western. But Soldier Blue was an extremely critical film of a massacre, the Sand Creek Massacre of 1864, against indigenous Cheyenne and Arapaho peoples. So it's very much anti-militaristic, anti-imperialistic protest film, that also equally in parallel was seeking to protest the Vietnam War, very similar atrocities happening there. So I think that kind of critique, that kind of artistic juxtaposition very much plays out in Star Trek, where we see the original series criticizing the Cold War, the Vietnam War, white supremacy. And I think it's I want to make a parallel here between Star Trek and the writings of Lev Tolstoy, because Tolstoy, of course, he was a Russian, a great Russian, a white Russian, a privileged Russian, who in his youth, fought in the Russian military in the Caucasus, right? Very much an imperialistic enterprise, we can say. But in his writings, through his experiences with war, he came to criticize, or to become critical of, imperialism and expansionism and racism, as we see in the Cossacks and Hajin Red. So I think in a certain way, we can see Star Trek, we can analyze Star Trek in a similar way. And it's not for nothing, I want to say here, that, the USS Tolstoy is mentioned during the Battle of Wolf 359, which is, a very famous battle between the Borg cube and Starfleet Armada that fails in defending against it. And then, so the last thing I want to say here is that, to the question specifically, is the Federation an empire? Well, imperialism implies coercion. In the Federation, new planets that want to join the Federation have the choice to join them or not. I believe on the other side that the Federation itself has, in the Federation Council, can also vote on new members, although I might be mistaken about that. And I also understand that, member planets of the Federation are allowed to secede, or at least there are some kind of protocols for that possibility, which suggests that it's not an empire. So, if we look at freedom of association, non-intervention via the Prime Directive, I would say that this is not really imperialism.
Yeah, I think that those hit all the right notes in thinking about this. I've always said that the biggest piece of evidence for against the idea that it's imperialist is in fact the General Order Number 1, the Prime Directive. I mean, because I think that that's a sort of um, conscious kind of tool brought into the universe to think about what are the ethical implications of cross-cultural interaction. And so I think that early on they were trying to think about this in various ways. And so while it was portrayed, it did have Star Trek, the original series had the kind of narrative markers of a Western of going from town to town, place to place. They were aware in some sense of the problems that brings across with paternalism, with coercion, as you've mentioned. And I think over the decades, they've tried to build a kind of a way of thinking about that, mechanisms of thinking about what would it be to be in an association, a galactic association based on principles of non-intervention and free association, as you mentioned. So I think that there's something right to that. And I mean, I think that something that again I want to encourage you to think about watching Lower Decks and Picard, or I'm not sorry, Lower Decks and Prodigy, the other animated series, because something that's come out in both of those animated series is what is the potential damage to a civilization as a result of first contact with the Federation. And does the Federation live up to its obligations after first contact? So raising these kinds of questions about, once first contact is made with a strange new world, what do then become the ethical obligations of an organization like the Federation to a people like that? And can this be really dangerous and destabilizing to a civilization to be contacted in that way? And so I found that those kinds of reflections coming out of the animated series to be something that actually reverberates with a lot of the kind of work that I think that Ursula Le Guin did with some of her science fiction, with the care that she builds into thinking about first contact, and and the deep study that needs to take place sometimes for generations before her version of the Federation can actually contact with a civilization. So I think that you're right. I think that Star Trek has built-in mechanisms over time to be much more sophisticated about these questions about imperialism. And the last thing I'll say about this is I had a conversation once with the science fiction writer David Brin about the militarism of Star Trek, and he said, yes, Starfleet is kind of a militaristic order. It has rank and so forth. He says, but it's not a navy in the traditional kind of sense of the Navy. He said, if I thought about it, this is David Brin, he said, I think it more of like the U.S. Coast Guard, sort of a kind of a military light, as he put it. Not to say that that service isn't hard, but it doesn't have the same kind of militaristic sort of overtones that something like the U.S. Navy does, or the Marines. I guess that could be debatable in some ways, but I thought that it was interesting that when we think about what does militaristic mean, there could be a variety of different ways in which we take that. And I think that Star Trek too, if you think about what happens in the Next Generation, yes, the Enterprise D is a Starfleet vessel. Yes, there's rank, but it's a weird kind of ship because there's families. It's more like a cruise ship than anything. So if it's a military ship, it's a very odd and strange kind of military. And maybe that means that part of what the 23rd century means for us is reassessing what it means to have a military, or to have something like that as part of our societies. Maybe the military gets reassessed in some kind of way that it becomes something different. I mean, that's an interesting conversation to think about as well. But I want to start wrapping up this conversation, even though I could go on for hours with you both about some of this stuff. I wanted to ask you about where you're going with this kind of project now. I know that this isn't the first time that you've written about finding radical themes in popular culture. In fact, in your article in Perspectives on Anarchist Theory, you talk about how you did a reading of this kind of sort of Wagner's The Ring. And I just wonder, given your interest in science fiction themes, are you thinking about doing this kind of excavation of radical ideas in other places of pop culture, in other stories of science fiction? Where does your work go now?
Well, Javier and I, as you just mentioned, wrote an article on the affinities between the classical composer Richard Wagner and the philosopher Mikhail Bakunin, and we wrote about different themes such as feminism, anti-feminism, revolutionism, and anti-Semitism, and that was a really fun project, but not exactly pop culture, more like high culture, classical music versus philosophy. Right now, we are discussing another project, but not on pop culture. We are thinking about writing about the philosophy of the classical composer Gustav Mahler. And in fact, I think we mentioned this in our article, the first two notes of the first symphony of Mahler, the first two notes of the musical theme of Star Trek are the first two notes of the first symphony of Mahler. But about pop culture, we at the moment, maybe we'll have to come up with an interesting project.
Yeah, I mean, for my own intellectual work, I do have an upcoming review about pop culture of Cyberpunk 2077, which is kind of the thing that got all this started a couple of years ago. Actually, it's very interesting. I really enjoyed it. Really, science fiction, all the themes, anti-capitalist themes and anti-authoritarian themes. But again, all the contradictions of science fiction media and profit and all that too. Beyond that, I did just finish, I wrapped up a review, collective book review of different recent anti-fascist volumes. And also I have a new book coming out later this month called Queer Tolstoy. So I'm, planning the book release, the book launch, and other book tour events for that. But yeah, thanks so much, Jose Antonio, for giving us this space. We really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your interest.
No, I thank you both for your work in all of this. I mean, I want to encourage you, as you're thinking about, you sound both very busy in your work. I do want to encourage you to think about spending some time with Lower Decks.
Okay, we can do that.
And perhaps Prodigy, and come back and talk about what you think about radical themes embedded in there. But I want to thank you for your work. I found it, as I just have said, just in this conversation, I've come to reassess a certain kind of understanding I had about the Star Trek universe. I would love to see this kind of analysis that you bring to other sorts of works. I know, for instance, like Leah McKagan has extended her analysis of imperialism to other franchises like Battlestar Galactica. She has, I think, a couple of articles on imperialist themes there, which I think is a little bit more obvious, but perhaps something to look at. It'd be interesting to see what you think about finding anarchist and revolutionary themes in other sorts of these major sort of pop culture franchises, Battlestar Galactica, or the big one that we will probably see in the next year or so on screen, Dune.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. So in any case, I would love if you come up with some more ideas of any of these kinds of franchises to come on back and speak with us here. It would be my pleasure to unpack some of these ideas with you.
Wonderful.
Absolutely.
We'll keep
that in mind.
Absolutely.
Thanks a lot, Jose Antonio.
All right. Well, thank you. My guests have been Maria and Javier Castro, talking about anarchism in Star Trek Picard. Thank you both for your time, and thank all of you for sharing your time listening to us or watching us on our video platforms. If you have any questions, or if you'd like to talk about some of the radical ideas that you have found in Star Trek or Star Trek Picard in general, Star Trek Picard season 3 is coming out in about another month or so. So we're looking forward to that. But we'd love to hear your thoughts. Please go ahead and leave us a comment. We will leave a link to Javier and Maria's article in our program notes, so you can take a look at that. Let us know what you think. But please let us know your thoughts. You can find the Anarchist project on a variety of different social media, including Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, Mastodon. We'd love to chat with you. So thank you once again, Javier, Maria. Pleasure to meet you both.